Okay. All right, so good morning, everyone. My name's Brian Robertson, Manager of Supply Resource Planning with Cascade. And today we are discussing our 8th Technical Advisory Group meeting, where we're focusing on the resource integration piece. I want to remind folks that we are looking at purely methodology today. We don't have any RNG or hydrogen projections to share, anything like that. We're just discussing methodology and what we're going to do with those projections and with different customer growths, and how to integrate those into a plan, an overall plan. Just wanted to remind folks as well, if you come off mute, please make sure to introduce yourself, your name, and the organization that you are representing today. That way we know who you are and we can make sure that we accurately, if we need to reach back out and respond later, we know who to send it to and we can accurately get that into the minutes. Also wanted to remind folks that we do have our web page out there. We have all 7 targeted tag meeting presentations posted, the minutes for those presentations, and the video recording. So if you missed one and you're interested in reading about it or watching the video, please feel free to reach out to that. And it's a great source to kind of catch up on things that have happened already. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. We have irp@cngc.com as our email address. So please reach out with any questions. Throughout this meeting, please feel free to raise your hand, interrupt us, put a question in the chat if you feel more comfortable doing that. You don't have to wait till the end. Feel free to jump in at any moment and ask your question. Okay. So I think we can go ahead and get started. Yeah, like I had mentioned, we'll have a little bit of a safety moment and then we'll jump into resource integration. We'll talk low carbon alternative fuels. We'll talk a little bit about the Plexos model. If anyone is interested in jumping more into the Plexos model, please reach out to me. We'll have a bigger presentation on the Plexos model during the larger tag meetings. This meeting will be just a little bit of an introduction as to what the Plexos model is. And then throughout the meeting and at the end, we'll be asking for feedback. So feel free to wait until the end if you want, or you can jump in at any moment. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Jenny for the safety moment and the low carbon alternative fuels presentation.
All right, thank you, Brian. My name is Jenny DeBoer. I'm a resource planning economist with Cascade Natural Gas, and I work on Brian's team. Today, we're going to do a quick safety moment, just how to be prepared to respond without your smartphone. There are often times where maybe your phone is stolen or destroyed, and you're going to need to access those information on your phone and those numbers. So try, if you can, to commit important numbers to memory from work, personal, or local emergency providers. If not, create a card or list of numbers to keep in your wallet and keep an extra copy inside your phone case in case your wallet gets broken and your phone gets locked out, but maybe you still have access to it a little bit. Also, in that case, you'll want to make sure to create an emergency contact list if your phone is locked and you cannot access it. That's it for our safety moment. Now I'm going to roll into low carbon alternative fuels. These are all being evaluated for our modeling. We're going to get a third party to get us projections on all of these low carbon alternative fuels that I'm going to be talking about. First one is renewable natural gas. RNG comes from biogas, and the biogas feed comes from a couple of different places. The first one can come from landfills. Waste is collected from residential, industrial, and commercial entities, and then rather than take place in an anaerobic digester, it actually takes place in the ground. Biogas also comes from livestock operations. Manure is collected and then delivered to an anaerobic digester. Biogas can also come from wastewater treatment. The digestion of solids in that wastewater treatment produces biogas. And then additionally, biogas can come from organic waste food manufacturers, wholesalers, supermarkets, restaurants, hospitals, etc. If you look at the graph over here on the right, you see in the top left corner, there's a picture of a digester. There are two outputs, a digested material, a gas. That digested material becomes fertilizer, soil amendments, animal bedding, and other products. And then the gas is taken, moisture is removed, it's flared, sulfur is removed and compressed, and that is what becomes biogas. In order to get a more pure version to put on our pipeline called RNG, goes through another refinement process where CO2 is removed and it's further compressed. And then it becomes RNG and it can go on our pipelines. Some benefits of RNG are fuel diversity. The use of RNG increases and diversifies domestic energy production. RNG can also be used as a baseload fuel with high availability rates. Additionally, it leverages existing infrastructure such as pipelines and heavy-duty vehicles. As we previously discussed, biogas feedstocks for RNG are generated continuously and from a variety of sources. There are also economic benefits from the use of RNG. The development of RNG projects can benefit the local economy through the construction of RNG processing and fueling station infrastructure and sale of natural gas powered vehicles. National, state, and local incentives may be available depending on the end use, such as credits for production of RNG used for vehicle fuel. These financial incentives can provide additional economic drivers for project development. I see there's a hand up.
Yeah, this is Byron Herman from the Washington UTC. Good morning. Here, you guys are saying that there's a high availability rates. I guess in previous discussions with Cascade staff, it sounds like the general takeaway around these fuels is that there's kind of a generalized scarcity and then like uncertainty around their availability. Has that changed, or I guess could you talk a bit more about the availability of RNG?
If Devin is on, I'll probably have him take that answer.
Yeah, I can jump in real quick. So this is Devin McGreal, Renewable Resources Manager here with Cascade. I don't think anything has changed per se. This is more of a qualitative statement than a quantitative statement, I would say. I will say anecdotally, my experience right now has been we have not had difficulty, at least in the short term, procuring projects. We've actually, I can't get into too many details about it, but we've actually turned away projects just that were not necessarily economical or cost effective for us. Or even frankly that we hadn't seen a short or even midterm need for. So I think this is not meant to be indicative of any kind of quantitative analysis. I think the results of the study that Brian talked about earlier will help to clarify that. It's more of a qualitative statement that and it may be frankly a little bit of a dated statement, but it certainly for a while was an untapped resource that gave an opportunity, or now gives an opportunity for an additional source of natural gas to be put into our systems.
Thanks, Devin. I guess one more kind of follow-up question about that is the slide here says that you generated continuously. I think in previous conversations that we've had, there's been this kind of understanding that there's a kind of like seasonal variation due to like climatic temperatures and stuff like that promotes or kind of restrains RNG production. Is that still the case, or?
So as the answer to most things in this world, I'm going to say it depends. To give an example, I just had a conversation. It depends on feedstock mostly. I just had a conversation with a producer for a food waste project, and I asked that exact question because that was something that I was curious about. They said that there was no seasonality to the generation to it. So that's one that was a kind of continuous to this statement. It probably should say some feedstocks can generate continuously. That was an example of a project where the developer was able to confirm for me that it was, regardless of variability in temperature, there was continuous generation. To your point though, yes, there is still a lot of unknowns about how I don't want to say reliable, but the volumes that can be generated for certain projects, landfills typically being the most weather variant projects. But there are certainly projects we've identified firsthand that do have that continuous generation.
Thank you, Devin. I appreciate that context.
Yeah, you bet. Absolutely.
Quinn, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, yes, Quid Weber with the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. I'm getting out a little bit ahead of the slide here, but I'm curious about the development of the RNG for vehicle fuel. Is that something kind of, I don't have a lot of information about that, and I'm kind of curious about it.
Yeah, I can. Jenny, do you want me to jump in?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so this language here came from US EPA, and so it's more of a general economic benefit of RNG nationwide and not necessarily specifically for Cascade. So we don't plan on using national credits for vehicle use. We would be looking at these incentives and the credits for use of retiring and using towards the CCA. So yeah, as of right now, we don't have any plans for vehicle use.
I can jump in on that though, also just to add a little bit of context to that. Once again, this is Devin from Cascade. It's not necessarily something as a regulated utility that we are actively looking at, but the fuel stations do provide definitely an interesting alternative / conversation to be had as a theoretically an optimization resource, knowing that we need to hit certain targets. If we were to have, say, and let's say, just for hypotheticals, let's say we had a food waste project that was not eligible for, because mostly the fuel, the CNG vehicles are used for D3 RINs, which are priced really well on the market right now. And let's say we had a project that was currently online that could go through that avenue. And then somebody else came to us with a project, let's say a food waste project that would not be eligible in the RIN or for a D3 RIN marketplace. There is theoretically an optimization that we could do around that, where we would go ahead and secure a contract for that RNG fueling station, make up those volumes on the D5. And at this point, that's probably not something that I would see us doing, just because it's frankly, there is risk associated with something like that. And I don't think the benefits are necessarily there that equate to the risk associated with that. The reason I mention all this is it is theoretically an avenue that can be explored, and something that, in a holistic IRP, we need to at least look at all possible avenues for everything that we do, right? So I think that's why that language is in there, even though it's more on the, I'd say, theoretical side versus something that we would actually act on at this moment.
Interesting. Thank you for the answer.
But
Right, I don't see any more hands, so I will continue on. More benefits from RNG is air quality benefit. Replacing traditional diesel or gasoline with RNG can significantly reduce emissions of nitrogen oxides and particulate matter, resulting in local air quality benefits. RNG is comprised primarily of methane, and compared to fossil natural gas, RNG contains 0 to very low levels of constituents such as ethane, propane, butane, pentane, and other traces of hydrocarbons. There's also a benefit of greenhouse gas reductions. RNG projects capture and recover methane produced at a landfill or anaerobic digestion facility, as previously talked about. And methane has a higher global warming potential than CO2, something like 25 times greater than that, with a relatively short atmospheric life of 12 years. So reducing these emissions can achieve near-term beneficial impacts in mitigating global climate change. For facilities that are not already required to mitigate such emissions, an RNG project can reduce methane emissions significantly. Byron?
Hello again. So for the local air quality benefits, if a customer were to sign up for the voluntary RNG program, would they expect these local air quality benefits? I'm not under the impression that they would, since my understanding is that RNG would just be put onto the system as a whole. Is that right?
I think we thought this would be more of a societal benefit rather than tied to a particular customer. When RNG is put onto our system, depending on where that project is at, it's at different locations, and we can't trace exactly, like, say we want these molecules to go and be served at this customer's house. It's so we can't exactly say, yes, you're going to be receiving these molecules of RNG.
Okay. And I just have a question going back one slide about like let's see, the economic benefits. Has Cascade done any kind of equity analysis around like contracting for RNG, or is it just we're at like a point where like the field is just so small that there really isn't like room to do that kind of analysis?
Noemi, did you want to say something, or?
Yeah, I can take that. Noemi Ortiz, Energy Efficiency Manager with Cascade Natural Gas. So today, this is something that we are working to incorporate into our cost-benefit equity analysis to both decide what percentage of these projects would go to minority, people of color, women-owned businesses, small businesses, and underrepresented in rural areas. So to my knowledge, it's not something that we're currently doing, but it is something that we're working on as we create the cost-benefit analysis and the cost-benefit and equity analysis.
Thank you, Noemi. I look forward to that.
Yes.
Is that all you needed from this page, Byron?
Yep. Thanks for checking in.
And were there any more questions on this slide we just went through?
Not for me.
Next, we'll get into hydrogen. We've talked about hydrogen a little bit more than some of the other alternative fuels. I'm not going to go into every single example, but mainly we're focusing on green and pink. Green hydrogen involves utilizing electrolysis from renewables to split the molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. And this is the key part of that is renewable. Can't be the electricity that goes into the electrolysis can't come from fossil fuels. Then pink is very similar to green hydrogen, but rather than using renewable energy or renewable electricity for the electrolysis, it uses nuclear energy. For hydrogen, we're looking at a couple different options, either blending into our pipelines or having a dedicated hydrogen-only pipeline to our large volume customers. But any of these types of hydrogen costs depend on the type where applicable, but there are going to be storage costs, hydrogen pipeline costs, electrolyzer costs, and then the energy required to run those electrolyzers, water costs, and then any other unique production costs. Synthetic methane is green and pink hydrogen that's made through electrolysis and can be combined with waste CO2 to produce synthetic methane using a chemical or biological process. This process is known as methanation, and it entails incremental costs to that production of green and pink hydrogen. Carbon capture is another low alternative fuel. Carbon capture and storage is a process in which a relatively pure stream of carbon dioxide from industrial sources is separated, treated, and transported to a long-term storage location. Carbon capture is not currently eligible for Washington or Oregon compliance programs, but these projects could provide a way to offset carbon. So we are looking at carbon capture for all customers. Next, renewable thermal certificates. Renewable Thermal Certificate, or RTC, is a market-based instrument designed to incentivize the use of renewable energy sources for heating and cooling purposes. RECs, or renewable energy credits, have traditionally focused on electricity generation from renewable sources like wind or solar, but RTCs specifically target the use of renewable energy for thermal applications, such as space heating, water heating, and industrial processes. The mechanism works by assigning a certain value or credit to each unit of the renewable thermal energy produced or consumed. These credits can then be traded or sold on the market, allowing entities to generate excess renewable thermal energy to sell their credits to those who need them to meet regulatory requirements or just sustainability goals. RTC programs vary by region and may be implemented at the state or regional level, often part of a broader renewable energy or greenhouse gas reduction initiative. And by creating a market for renewable thermal energy, RTCs help drive investment in renewable heating and cooling technologies, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and promoting the transition to a more sustainable energy system. So for all these low carbon alternatives fuels that we discussed, we are looking to consult a third party and then get projections. And then, like Brian said, include these projections into our model. Each of these low carbon alternative fuels would be evaluated through a reference case and then have Monte Carlo simulations. The reference case for RNG, different types of colors of hydrogen, synthetic methane, carbon capture, RTCs, everything we discussed. There'd be the reference case would contain deterministic or expected values for the levelized cost, technical potential, resource life, and then carbon intensity. And then for each of those low carbon alternative fuels, there would be Monte Carlo simulations, 1,000 draws on levelized costs, 1,000 draws on technical potential, and then resource life and carbon intensity would be held constant. And these correlation shocks across time and fuel resources would be happening where appropriate.
Jenny, we have a question in the chat. Will is asking, are RTCs eligible to be used for CCA compliance in Washington? I'll have Devin or Abby correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the answer is yes. It's my understanding that when we were doing the IRP, the 2023 IRP a couple of years ago, originally it was up in the air as to whether we would be able to use RTCs or not. But I think the final rulemaking has allowed RTCs, but I'll let someone confirm or correct me if I'm wrong. Okay.
Yeah,
so Abby said yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
I responded in the chat because I figured I would put it in there for that as well. But yes, they can be used for CCA compliance.
Great, thank you.
All right, if there are no further questions, I will hand it back to Brian.
All right, thank you, Jenny. Yeah, I'm going to jump into electrification and how Cascade is kind of approaching electrification. So how should electrification be modeled? So we've taken a couple approaches at this. Last IRP, we took the approach of let's just model electrification as if it's going to happen at a certain rate. We want to take a little bit of a different approach this time and try to gather some information about the costs on the electric side of things and model it that way as an alternative resource, similar to how like DSM, so a little bit differently than DSM, but like something similar to RNG, but instead of the RNG supply, we would supplying gas customers, it would be the electric supplying electric customers, so reducing our load. So some information that we are thinking is needed is so the technical potential, what is possibly out there. We're looking at a uniform distribution of when customers may make that decision. Ultimately, the best time for a customer to make that decision is likely going to be when their gas furnace is at the end of its useful life and they need to replace it. So option 1 is replace it with a gas furnace. Option 2 is replace it with electric appliance. And so that's kind of how we're looking at that. We are also considering, this is still something that we're looking at, but let's say if someone has 5 years left on their useful life, we may include having a decision point there as well, where the cost to electrify would be a little bit higher because there's still some value on that furnace, or there may be a customer who's paying it off still. And so they would have to pay that cost while also paying to electrify. It would be helpful to get electricity costs by area, electrification data such as gas to electric conversion rates and efficiencies. And then are there any others that anyone can think of as of right now? So I've reached out to a few electric serving utilities in our service territory. One of them is unable to coordinate with us until later this summer. So that's something that's out there that we're looking at. I've worked with PSE in helping coordinate an electrification study on their end. However, they have not put any results in their IRP yet, so I don't know what that looks like yet. We may be able to glean some information from there. I've touched base with a PUD to try and gain some more understanding on how the PUD is looking at electrification, and how they may incorporate it. So we're also looking at different sources that we could use internally to look at those costs. We're hoping to have an expected cost scenario and a low cost scenario. That way we can look at both of them. But if there's any sources or any thoughts from other people on how to approach this, I'm more than open to listening to those. And so if you do have any thoughts, please feel free to shoot those our way. Yeah, Will.
Hi, this is Will from NWEC. Just have some shots I'd like to share with you, Brian.
Uh-huh.
I know PSC is a good part of your service territory. I would encourage the company to work with PSC bilaterally. I don't know if they're going to file a 2025 IRP, or there may be some extended process on that, because I think they're going to do a combined gas and electric plant in 2027. So I would just encourage Cascade to not rely on an IRP coming out for PSE, but to just work with the company individually to get the information you need. Another thing, you talked about 2 scenarios, one where on the burnout of the appliance, the customer either does a gas furnace or just electrification. I would encourage the company to do a dual fuel heat pump scenario. That seems like a reasonable action for a customer to make. So I think that would be a third, and it'd be interesting to get the results on that. The third thing I'd say is I'd be interested in electricity costs on a more granular level. Cascade has service territory throughout Washington with a variety of electricity costs. You have the IOUs, which are on the high end, and then you have someone like Chelan in your Wenatchee area, which has like 3 cents per kilowatt hour residential rates. They have long generation. I think if we're going to look at electrification and what it costs on the utility, there's some utilities that might be inexpensive for the utility to electrify and inexpensive for the customers. And I just think that would be helpful to be on a more granular approach than just do like a peanut butter. Here's the electricity costs throughout our service territory. So those are the 3 pieces of feedback I have on this item.
Appreciate that. Quinn, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce Will's first point about working bilaterally with PSE, because 1589 passed, that allows them to file to put off their IRP and file a work plan instead. And my indication is that they plan to do that. Excuse me. And so yeah, I would not rely on PSE coming out with a IRP wholesale, but they will file a work plan, and that will then come to the commission and be decided upon of like what they should file instead, or if they'll wait to file the full integrated system plan.
And that's helpful feedback. And PSE is one of the ones that I've been trying to coordinate with. And so that I'm kind of waiting on their end to coordinate with them. I'm more than happy to coordinate with them and work with them on it. But unfortunately at this time, it sounds like they're pretty busy. So it may be a bit until I can coordinate with them. Thanks for that feedback. I appreciate it. And talk a little bit about Plexos optimization model. So for those who are not familiar with Plexos, Byron, I see you have a question.
Yeah, could you go back 2 slides, please?
Yep.
Could you explain a bit more about like how Plexos is going to be making the decision around electrification as a resource? Like what exactly is the selection logic there?
Yeah. And how about we wait until I get to the resource integration piece,
Okay,
and
sure.
I can try to explain it there.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, so Plexos, this is our resource optimization model. This is where we plug in our load forecast and we say, hey, this is what we expect our customers' demand to be, this customer growth. This is what our weather looks like. It comes up with demand over a planning horizon. And then we plug in our DSM that we have, and it will decrement the demand based on the expected amount of demand side management that we can get. And then we also plug in our traditional natural gas, our RNG, our hydrogen, synthetic methane, all those low carbon alternative fuels. We put our transportation contracts in there, our storage contracts. So it really takes in everything that you can think of. It has discount rates, things like that. And so what the model does is it helps develop and analyze a variety of resource portfolios to help determine the type, the size, and timing of resources best matched for that requirement, that forecast requirement. Plexos is a very powerful and complex tool. So it operates by combining a series of existing and potential demand side management and supply side resources, and optimizes for the lowest net present value, net present cost over the entire planning horizon, while also taking into consideration carbon compliance goals. Plexos is a unified energy modeling and forecasting software platform. This is language straight from Energy Exemplar. There's a link at the bottom. Hopefully everyone can find that. If not, let me know and I can add the link to the chat. It's a powerful simulation engine, analyzes zonal and nodal energy models ranging from long-term investments, but it can also do medium-term operation planning, down to even short-term hourly and intra-hourly market simulations. It is important to remember, though, that Plexos provides helpful information, but we also have to kind of take the approach that it may be a little too perfect. We'll have to keep an eye on things, some decisions that it makes, to make sure that it's not doing something that operationally we wouldn't actually do. So what are some of the modeling challenges? Well, we got to make sure that supply gets to the customer. So we got to make sure our transportation is put in correctly, our storage contracts are put in correctly, make sure everything's connected correctly. So there's a lot of time and effort put into that to make sure that everything is lined up the way it's supposed to be. Several of Cascade's contracts were entered into a long time ago. So each IRP, we have to take a look at it and say, hey, do these contracts still make sense? Do they align with our current day customer growth and usage? We look at different opportunities. Hey, if we have excess gas here because we just didn't grow and we grew too much over here we weren't expecting, we'll have conversations with the pipeline and see if there's some deals we can make to optimize our system better that way. Some of the receipt quantity and aggregate delivery quantity can help identify resource deficiency. So if we don't have enough supply or storage or transportation, we can identify any deficiencies there. So taking the aggregate look can mask individual city gate issues for loop sections, while the disaggregated look can create deficiencies where they don't exist. So it's important for us to, we have aggregated things up to the pipeline zonal level, but it'll be important for us to also maintain a city gate level information to make sure that we are able to meet the city gate needs as well. And I know that our distribution system planning team does a great job of analyzing that. In many cases, operational capacity is greater than contracted. Supply, storage, and upstream transportation focuses on the core, but the non-core must be included for emissions modeling. So the way that we end up doing that is we kind of have two different systems. It's all in the same Plexos model, but the non-core side, they end up purchasing their own gas. And in order to not capture those costs in our model, we have to just supply them with the free gas. And then we also give them transportation so they can serve the customers, but we count those emissions towards our emissions, anyone who we're responsible for under the CCA and CPP, or the potential CPP. And again, Plexos is perfect knowledge, so we got to keep an eye on it, make sure it's not making a resource decision in year one, thinking about something that's happening in year 7 or whatever. Yeah, Quinn?
Yeah, I'm curious. I have two questions here. I'm curious if to what extent Plexos models leakage from transportation, as well as more about the transportation agreements. Are these things that have renegotiation periods or anything like that? Or are you kind of just stuck into, you've signed this agreement for, I don't know, we'll go 20 years and kind of nothing you can do about it until the agreement's over?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first question. When you say leakage, you're talking more like fuel loss?
Correct.
Yeah, we model fuel loss in the transportation contract. So it'll incorporate fuel loss, which means we'll have to purchase more gas to get the gas down to our customers. So we do incorporate the fuel loss for each contract that does have fuel loss. I know there's some contracts that we don't pay a fuel loss on, so we don't have that. But that is included. And then sorry, can you repeat the second question real quick?
That's on the computer. Yeah, I'm just curious about, are a lot of the transportation agreements pretty much locked in, or do most of them have renegotiation periods after certain amounts of time?
Yeah, I'm not. I don't think there's renegotiation periods. I think you're pretty much locked in. But like I had mentioned before, there are opportunities to look at offloading contracts, like a capacity release. You can look into those, where you release the contract to someone else. They may not pay the full cost, but you may be able to get some relief if you don't need that contract anymore. So there's those opportunities. Some of the contracts we do have are coming up for renegotiation next couple of years. So we'll be throughout the optimization process, we'll be looking at those, to see when we would need those, if we would need those transportation contracts. So, for example, in a declining growth scenario, there may be more opportunities to not renew a contract when it's up for, when it's time to decide if we're going to renew it or not. Does that
Brian,
help
can-
answer your question?
Brian, can I chime in here a minute on contracts?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that some of them are evergreen contracts where they renew automatically, because we know we're going to need that capacity. And then some of them have expiration dates where well before the expiration date, they're being renegotiated.
Great, thank you for the answers.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. So here's a little bit of an example of what Plexos looks like. Here on the right, this is actually a picture of our system when we had set it up. And these are all the different folders where you can put inputs into and things like that. So we have demand, we have supply, we have the price forecast, storage, transportation, constraints, any, and then emissions. Again, I'll dive into those a lot more into our longer tag meeting. But if anyone is curious about Plexos and want to dive into it before the tag meetings, please reach out. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about resource integration now. And we're taking a little bit of a different approach this IRP. This is what we would like to do. So if you think about all the possible outcomes in the future, there are an infinite number of possible outcomes. You can have growth, you can have flat growth, low growth, all different combinations of low growth, all different combinations of high growth. You can have different combinations of weather, you can have different combinations of policies that come into place. But when you think about like modeling an infinite amount of portfolios or scenarios, that's impossible. So the goal is to try to identify the most likely cases that we may see. And maybe not the most likely, but for example, on the growth side, maybe more of the extreme ends. That way we have an understanding of what could possibly happen, and what we need to prepare for. So we tried to identify very reasonable, high, medium, and low growth scenarios. So you can see there customer growth. We're looking at Washington State Building Code Council with flat customer growth. And the idea of the flat customer growth is that we may not see a lot of building stock attrition loss. There could be a lot more people choosing to renovate their home at the end of the lifespan of their home rather than totally destructing their house. So that is very much a possibility. I know right now we're looking into trying to get more details from our previous customers on the number of retirements we've had. So hopefully that'll shed some more light on a better building stock attrition rate. We're also looking at Washington State Building Code Council rules with 1.5% decay in building stock attrition. Now, the 1.5% decay, that's not all towards building stock attrition rate. I know WTC staff had sent over some questions about renters unable to electrify or deciding to not want to purchase homes that have natural gas. Now, the purpose of these growth scenarios is try to capture all of these encompassing possible consumer behavior possibilities. And so that's what we're trying to capture in these high and low growth rates. The next one is the Washington State building codes are repealed in 2 years. I think that's a good amount of time to kind of estimate a repeal on the building codes. If anyone thinks we should do a different time period, I'm open to hearing that. And then what would end up happening in that case is we would think that customers would then return to choosing to take on natural gas appliances. So that's kind of our higher end growth scenario. So then we move to the climate regulation, and we're gonna model Climate Commitment Act and then Climate Protection Plan as best as we understand that plan at the time of our modeling. In the case that the Climate Commitment Act is voted down in November and the Climate Protection Plan gets overturned or doesn't get set up for whatever reason, then our next scenario that we're going to model is the social cost of carbon. And we're not going to do a scenario where there's no carbon costs included. So we'll have the social cost of carbon as that scenario. So looking at electrification, again, we'd like to try and do expected costs and low costs. It all depends on if we're able to get that information. Weather, we're looking at the SSP 2-4.5 and the SSP 3-7.0. And then the low carbon alternative fuels will be we'll be using Monte Carlo simulations for those. Yeah, Quinn.
Sorry, to what extent are you modeling geothermal resources? I know you had mentioned, I think it was last tag, about starting to integrate the thermal energy network pilots.
Yeah, no, that's
just trying to account for that.
That's a fair question. Yeah, so I would love to model geothermal networks in the IRP. As of right now, there's a little bit of a lack of data to model. We need to answer a few questions as to whether are we going to be trying to retrofit current customers, or are we just focusing on new customer growth? What do the costs look like? So I know that there's a lot of internal folks working on trying to find some projects, talk to folks to see if we can get some data on that. So yeah, we're definitely not closing the door on geothermal network, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done for us to include it. We'll definitely have a narrative around geothermal network and where we're currently at the least in the IRP. So here we have a little more on resource integration. Oh yeah, Byron, go ahead.
Going back to the various growth and degrowth scenarios, has Cascade started to do a kind of like equity analysis around like what the kind of equity implications are, like which customers might be more likely to electrify and which ones might not? And if there were to be a large move toward electrification, who might be kind of left on the gas system in those certain situations and stuff? Has there been any analysis around that?
So we've taken so we have a map with highly impacted communities, and we've taken our fixed network data and started looking at some price elasticities with different income levels and different highly impacted communities. However, I don't know, since electric prices have generally been more expensive than natural gas, I don't know if we're going to be able to identify which customers are likely going to be the first ones off. That's something I think we'll need to have more discussions on how to approach that. I'm open to ideas if you have any ideas of how to approach that, whether that be through surveys or whatever. But if you have any ideas, please feel free to shoot those our way.
Okay. Yeah, staff will give us some thoughts, see if we can put in kind of follow-up comments. I appreciate your kind of open-mindedness, this kind of question, the kind of tentative investigation you've started already into it. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things where it's kind of difficult to answer without any data. But we're more than willing to look at it and to consider it and think about it. We may not have the answers today or next year, but we'll definitely keep an eye on it. So looking at resource integration. So what we're thinking is we'll take the policies that are in place currently, and what we think is the most likeliest outcome, future outcome, or future profile for each of these things. So the current policy in place is the Washington State Building Codes. We want to run it with flat customer growth. The big reason for that is we don't want to under plan for our customers. So we want to make sure that we are planning for RNG, plenty of RNG, plenty of RTCs, anything like that. We want to make sure that we're ready for it. The reason why we went with flat customer growth is we still think we may get some customers who are looking at gas fireplace or barbecues, and things like that. And that would essentially not outpace, but have the same pace as maybe the building stock attrition rates. And so we're looking at that for our reference case. The current policy in place is Climate Commitment Act, and it's likely that there will be a climate protection plan in the future. So we're looking at that. Electrification would be the expected cost. The SSP model will utilize the SSP 3-7.0. And then for low carbon alternative fuels, we would use the deterministic values that come from that. For stochastic scenario modeling, what we'd like to do is take the different combinations of these. And so something to think about if you want to provide feedback on, hey, you guys should look at this scenario and you guys should look at that scenario. Each of these scenarios are a combination of one another. So if we add one, that just increases the number. The more you add, it increases the number of models we have to run exponentially. So if you're thinking about, hey, you should run this, maybe also consider, is there anything up here that we should replace it with, and things like that. So looking at the different combinations of growth policies, climate policies, electrification costs, and the climate models, and the low carbon alternative fuels. So with the 3 growth policies, 2 climate policies, and 2 electrification costs results, that results in 12 different scenarios, 12 different combinations. When you match that up with the different climate models, so 2 different climate models, now you're looking at 24 different combinations of scenarios. And then what we would like to do is take at least, we're shooting for 100 draws of low carbon alternative fuels. So these scenarios would result in 2,400 different draws. Now, when we have to think about the number of draws, it takes Plexos a little bit of time to run these models. So Cascade's current contract we're looking at is 10,000 core hours. So each model takes a certain number of cores. And so we have 10,000 core hours. So if one draw takes 16 core hours, then we're looking at only about 1,000. So we'll have to try to, there's something else we're looking at is trying to decrease the Plexos runtime to incorporate more of these draws. So there's definitely some balancing act here with the number of scenarios and modeling. And so the idea of this, I don't know if it's better to speak on this slide or the next slide. But the idea of this is to take a look at these different combinations. So let's say we have our low growth policy combination matched with our CCA CPP, matched with expected electrification costs, matched with our reference case for the climate model. And then we get to the low carbon alternative fuels, and we'll have 100,000 different 100 different draws. In those draws, you'll probably see a case where there's a low amount of RNG, a low amount of hydrogen, synthetic methane. So there's just a low number of these RNG. Maybe we say that this is our 5% probability of low carbon alternative fuels in terms of technical potential. Well, then what the model is going to do is it's going to take and look at electrification costs and compare it and say, look, you're not going to be able to meet your carbon goals, so you're going to have to electrify under this 5% case scenario. So we're going to have these 100 plus different draws with 100 plus different results. If RNG is plentiful and costs are really cheap, there may not be any electrification in that scenario. So the idea is to try and get 100 different futures for low carbon alternative fuels and mix and match those with different growth policies and climate policies and climate models and electrification costs. So once we get all those results, we need to kind of come up with a plan with it. And so looking at the short term, the idea is to look at the reference case for the short term, but also look at the stochastic models that align with that reference case. And we would come up with our 2 to 4 year action plan and look at, so this is what we expect our RNG to be in the 2 to 4 year action plan. This is what we expect hydrogen to look like. It may be we don't have any hydrogen, but we're going to test to make sure hydrogen works as a blend, or we're going to begin discussions with large volume customers about dedicated pipeline. So that may be what the action plan is. When we look at more of the long-term plan, the idea is to look at these different results and say, hey, in the low growth, you're looking at 10% probability of electrification under this, in this case. So this is what we have an idea for the future. If growth ends up moving in this direction, if RNG ends up moving in this direction, we should have a draw out there that can tell us, hey, this is what you guys are looking at in terms of a lowest reasonable cost option. We're in the long term, we're not going to have a preferred portfolio, but rather an understanding of all the different potential outcomes. And so it's not like we're going to say, hey, we prefer this outcome. We're not going to have a preference on the climate models, for example, like we, or anything like that. We just want to have an understanding of this is what's going to happen with this climate model. This is what could possibly happen with this climate model. Yeah, I see Kim, you have a question?
Thanks, Brian. I think this is a spot where we'll definitely want to have some more conversation. This was really problematic for us in a couple of gas IRPs in particular, and we should be having some more guidance coming out on that as we revisit our IRP guidelines, but the concerns around not having sort of a portfolio that you then are actually being able to articulate how well it performs in different future scenarios. It has made it difficult for the commission staff, especially, to understand sort of what your plans are, especially with any kind of long-term investment elements. It just helps us. Well, I think we end up missing sort of the counterfactual of like, okay, did we do something? Is there a path forward that does well under a variety of conditions, and you're able to see that when you've got that preferred portfolio. We recognize that you might, that the preferred portfolio was always wrong, but without having that, you're not able to really articulate how the action plan you're envisioning, or these near-term steps, are part of that long-term plan, and that it performs the best under the future scenarios in which you've tested it. So I think we want to have more conversation about what that means, especially in terms of what our IRP guidelines require.
Oh, definitely. And I appreciate that. And I guess the approach that we're trying to take here is that we're not trying to look for a singular way to look at the future. We're not trying to take and create like a policy for our IRP. We were trying to understand the different risks around each of these. We're trying to understand if growth goes in this direction, what does our future kind of look like? If growth goes in this direction, what does our future look like? Do we think there's enough RNG out there in a high growth scenario? If that's if we're noticing that, hey, we're lacking low alternative fuels in this high growth scenario, maybe there's something that we need to do to either be more active in getting these low carbon fuels, or we need to look into different ways of mitigating that load, things like that. So really what we're trying to do with all these different future portfolios is understanding those risks, and not trying to create one singular future for the company.
Yeah, I still think we're, like, I get that. I feel like we maybe, and I'm not being precise enough in my language, which is why I say we should have some more conversation about it. But I think the concern about, well, trying to have, like, I think we appreciate wanting to have having a plan that can accommodate flexibility and the ability to be responsive. And I think part of what we're looking for is, especially where near-term actions require significant investments, with that long-term investments, that we need to understand how that plays into different future scenarios. And I think some of the resources that you're envisioning are things that don't necessarily need like the kind of lead time one might imagine, whether it's you're contracting for RNG, or, you're just procuring the environmental attributes of it. But it's very different if what you're relying upon is developing and deploying energy efficiency programs or demand response programs, where you need to invest in, actual infrastructure. Like, those have long-term implications, and those, to me, suggest you don't have the ability to pivot. So you need to understand how those costs sort of manifest under those different future scenarios. So that's where I think I would be relying on a preferred portfolio, is especially for those things where there's a longer term or high capital intensive investment that perhaps reduces or risks sort of reducing your ability to be flexible and responsive to changing circumstances.
Got that. Yep. Yeah, that sounds good. And I'm definitely open to having a lot more conversations on that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions? I think we may be, yeah, towards the end. So are there any other questions about this approach? Any other thoughts? I think if there's any positive thoughts towards it too, I'd be happy to hear that as well. If you think there's other scenarios, anything that you think we're missing or should be added, please let me know. Byron, go ahead.
Yeah. Looking at the number of draws, it sounds like what you're articulating is that there's a kind of bottleneck in your process with regards to the number of draws that you can do just because of the sheer time constraint related to it. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. Yeah.
Is there a way to maintain statistical significance while reducing the number of draws? So for example, if we were to reduce it down to say 75 draws per scenario, how much would that impact statistical significance while opening up the number of scenarios that could be considered?
Yeah, I think what we'll need to do is do a little bit of testing on our end to see what that number is, to see where we can get some convergence. But yeah, we'll definitely look at that. There's some opportunities to reduce the time it takes to run Plexos. One of the nice things, actually, when I talk about the potential proposed schedule, is that if we are to push the IRP back a little bit, there's an opportunity for our modeling to fall where our contract renews for the next year. And so we can utilize more of our core hours. So we can use all of our core hours this year and next year's core hours to do these. So yeah, we're definitely going to do some testing. We're going to try to, I would personally like to run as many scenarios as possible, but there are some limitations there. So we'll try and keep everybody posted on that. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess another question I have was in previous meetings, I guess in a previous meeting, Caleb had said that the estimation around like building stock attrition was closer to 2% rather than 1.5%. Was there a significant change in your methodologies, or I guess rather Caleb and his team's methodology around that?
Yeah, so I went back and tried to clarify that 2%. And technically that 2% was not a building stock attrition rate. It was in the AEG model, the customers that fall into the new building identification, which it's my understanding that at that point, the customer makes a decision as to whether they want to renovate or remodel their home versus actually tear it down. And so if they end up renovating or remodeling, it's my understanding with the current building code council that they could still put gas appliances in. And so that 2% is actually quite a bit higher than we had originally anticipated. But like I had mentioned, we're trying to look at some actual information about customers who retire. It's probably not going to be perfect because customers don't actually have to give an explanation as to why they retire their gas service. So that number might be a little more on the high end. But we're definitely trying to take a look at our actual customer counts and seeing if we can figure out a better building stock attrition rate that way.
Okay. Because like, I was just kind of thinking, kind of like the way that percentages work is that even a 0.5% change relative to 1.5 to 2% can result in about a 15% change in the ratio of fixed cost to customers by 2050. And so like these small little variables now have fairly large like multiplicative impacts. Small things add up, when we get out to like 2050. And so part of like there's this kind of larger question about, I think staff articulated this in the comments the pre-tag comments that we sent, is that we would like to see a plausible worst case scenario. And so I guess what we mean by that isn't so much like dialing up all the variables up to 10 and then, seeing the world burn or, something like that, but kind of looking within like a standard deviation of what our norm is and just kind of dialing everything up to 7. So, we're not dialing up to 10 or 11, but, within a a standard deviation of plausibility of, what happens if we're looking at, say, let's say it is a 1.5% building stock attrition rate. Let's say that the Climate Commitment Act, the compliance costs stay, statistically higher toward the auction ceiling. Let's say that electrification costs go down due to IRA funding, due to, an influx of training for trade allies. Let's say that we have a colder future. So let's say that we're doing the colder of the two climate models. Let's say that, RNG isn't available at scale or cost effectively, and hydrogen, for various either engineering practical concerns or for cost concerns isn't widely available. All of these would have a kind of multiplicative rather than arithmetic impact on the outcome. And so, due to these nonlinearities, we're kind of curious, like, what happens if, to kind of put it simplistically, all the bad things happen? Like, what are the impacts on customers in that kind of a scenario? Would there be room to run that kind of a scenario?
It's possible. I'm curious, have you guys expressed this same concern on the electric side, and have they done any analysis on this to show kind of the impact on the electric side of things, of what that would look like taking on exponential customers?
So I mean, my understanding, I think Quinn will be a little bit more knowledgeable about this, is that PSE is starting to look at the kind of, in their electrification scenarios, they're looking at these kind of like load growth associated with gas customers. We haven't quite gotten to that point with Avista having that conversation yet, just because of the progress of where they are in their IRP.
Okay.
But I think that conversation's coming, yeah.
Yeah, because it would be helpful to understand the electric side of things and the cost there as well. Because I imagine in a worst case scenario for the natural gas side, it would end up resulting in a pretty tough scenario for the electric side to meet those customers' needs and things like that. So we definitely have to take that into consideration. Unfortunately, right now, we don't really have those cost information on the electric side. So it's kind of hard for us to model what that would look like in comparison to the electric side. We could model it against expected costs, although I would find that to be a highly unrealistic scenario.
Yeah, I mean, you're certainly right that, for example, like Puget Sound Energy, just around looking at EV adoption and gas customer electrification, they're looking at significant costs around transmission in order to make up that deficit. So I think that there is something to be said for, customer flight also results in the electric costs going up at the same time. And so there's this kind of stabilizing effect between those two variables.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's definitely something we'll consider and look at. We'll want to make sure that we understand that this may be a highly unlikely scenario. and model it that way. The goal here is, and the idea with the the Monte Carlos around the low carbon alternative fuels is to capture a scenario, a draw that has low RNG, high cost RNG's high cost. We'll also mix and match allowance costs in there as well, and try to have a draw that has low RNG, low amounts of hydrogen, low amounts of low carbon alternative fuels with a high allowance price, and see what happens in those cases. So we'll definitely have those draws in there. We just have to have an understanding that these may be low probability cases, and we'll have to decide, are we going to put together a full plan for these low probability scenarios? Do we just want to have an idea of what the company may end up doing in those scenarios? What does the plan look like in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends what comes out of the scenarios. Like if the scenario, like if we see these clear, like, you know, exponential instabilities, I think that's when we have to start having like a bigger conversation, you know, and also talking about, you know, what is the likelihood of this sort of a thing happening? But, you know, if the model comes out and, you know, things are fairly stable and there's no actual cause for alarm, then I think it'd probably be appropriate to say, hey, this is another scenario that we looked at, you know, these would be the ramifications of it, if that makes sense. But if it is, you know, we start looking at like higher, you know, customer losses that end up being really, really high, resulting in, you know, a ratio of fixed costs to customers that goes up exponentially, and we start seeing these real like large amounts of, or like, you know, high auction prices and stuff like that from CCA compliance and stuff. I think that's when we'd have to start another conversation, like if there is a distinct probability that it would happen.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I appreciate that. And yeah, I do want to reiterate that I find it important that we run these every 2 years. That way we can update our inputs and actuals that have happened over the last 2 years. And so even though we do have a long-term plan, that long-term plan is likely going to change in the next IRP, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's definitely important for us to continue running these IRPs. So I just wanted to point that out as well. So I'm going to jump into the proposed new plan. So like I had mentioned, we're still trying to work with PUDs and electric companies to try and gather as much information on the electric side. We're trying to do some more research on the building stock attrition rate and things like that. We're still looking at things on the equity side of the shop. And so it would be ideal for us to have a little more time for this IRP before we start locking in any numbers. And so what I've proposed here is to extend the IRP about 3 months, pushing back the first meeting to September, holding it September 12th. I'd still need to double check to make sure that none of these end up landing on holidays or anything like that. So there may be some small tweaks a day here or there, but most of it should be in place. With tag 2 coming up in October, and then we would file a first draft in December, and then give about 6 weeks for feedback on it. And then we would hold our final tag on in February, early February, and then file the final draft a month later. And then asking for comments due back mid-April. That way we could wrap up the IRP and file it in late May. So I wanted to pose that here, see if anyone had initial questions or initial concerns. If not, then if there's no pushback or any concerns on it, then I'll work on putting together a final work plan to file soon after this meeting. So I'll open it up for feedback on that, if there is any. Okay. So I'm not hearing anything, so yeah, I'll go ahead and work on that and get that filed as soon as possible. We may end up, so if, for example, if we have a breakthrough on electrification costs or anything like that, we may end up setting up a meeting prior to the Tag 1 meeting to get everyone together and say, hey, this is where we're at. Please give us feedback on it. So there may be some more targeted tags between now and September. But I know that there was a lot of feedback throughout these targeted tags that we would like to try to follow up on and incorporate as best as possible into our IRP. So getting a little bit more time on that would be helpful. I'm going to go back a few slides to here real quick to open it up one last time for questions, concerns, thoughts. Yeah, Alessandra.
Yeah, hi, thank you. This is Alessandra with Northwest Energy Coalition. My question is in regards to the alternative fuels. So just thinking about droughts and high temperatures and water shortages, how is Cascade thinking about water usage when deciding its resource plan? How are you considering like water intensive alternative fuels when making decisions? Any mitigation approaches, partnerships, or creative solutions that y'all are looking into in regards to water?
Yeah, so are you talking about water in terms of like
cooling down?
creating hydrogen, or
Yeah, really any part of the energy system, but yeah, like cooling down of power plants or with RNG, or just how much water is used in these systems.
yeah, I think we may have a little bit of information on that. I don't have the answers for you today on how much information is going to be included in terms of water. But I know on, what was this slide? With the hydrogen, I know that we'll be looking at like volume and cost of water to create the hydrogen. So we'll be looking at water there. There may be other opportunities for looking at water costs, but I don't necessarily have all the answers for you today on that. But we'll definitely take a look at it and get you an answer.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. All right, so again, I'll just put it up here. Contact us at irp@cgc.com with any questions that you have. If there's any scenarios or sensitivities that you want us to consider or anything like that, please feel free to send those over to us and we'll take a look at them. I'll pause for another 10 seconds or so. If I don't hear anything, we'll let everybody go.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Byron.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay.
Thanks, Brian.
Sounds like, yep. All right, thanks everyone.